The Civil War was the largest and most deadly battle waged on American soil. However, the battle for Black American rights did not end in the Appomattox Courthouse in 1865, nor did it end with President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, or the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. In fact, the battle for true African American freedom did not legally end until over 100 years later. This is the real Civil War. One of the main legal battles facing the freed slaves in the South were the Black Codes. Although these codes gave blacks civil rights, they mostly regulated or completely banned many others. Former slaves were allowed to own property, they were allowed to sue, but were not allowed to sue a white man. They could legally marry, however they could only marry other black people. They could testify in court, but could not testify against a white person. Even in the rights they were given, there were regulations when it came in relation with a white person. For the regulations of these black codes, freedmen were required to have a job, were forced into labor contracts with white farmers if they were found without employment, were arrested if they tried to legally terminate their labor contract early, and they weren't allowed to own firearms, as well as any black disturbing the peace by protesting, preaching the gospel without a license, which was unattainable in any case, purchasing alcohol, and more would result in imprisonment. These codes also allowed voting to be strictly regulated by literacy tests. Not only could many former slaves not read, but even for the ones who could, the tests were made to be almost impossible for even a white man to pass, yet white men were not required to pass any test. The codes managed to get away with this since they were technically not barring voting to any black man. Under the law, they simply had to pass a registration test, with few details listed on exactly how difficult the said test truly was. Even highly educated university professors today have attempted to pass the test and failed. The Southern Black Codes became more widely known as the Jim Crow laws. However, Jim Crow was not a real person. Jim Crow was actually a fictional character created by Thomas Dartmouth Rice for performances in the 1830s. He would paint his face black and talk in a stereotypically derogatory slave slang, all while leaping about, tripping, and falling over on stage. A terrible factor in allowing these codes, which were in clear violation of the emancipated slaves' constitutional rights, was the neglect of the federal government led by Andrew Johnson during Reconstruction. Thanks to President Johnson allowing almost every Confederate leader who was formerly a member of the federal government to be reinstated, the Southern government was being run by former Confederate leaders, making it incredibly simple for those states to avoid the loosely enforced federal laws. Clearly, the death of slavery did not automatically mean the birth of freedom. In the 1950s, the United States remained a heavily segregated society due to the Plessy v. Ferguson decision in 1896, which declared segregation as constitutional under its separate but equal court ruling. However, evidence of inequality between white and black facilities was very prevalent. White facilities garnered most of the federal and local funding, whereas the black communities were abandoned with almost no funding whatsoever. Clearly, the notion of separate but equal was not an attainable reality in the American society, or any free society. The most monumental case during the 50s freedom movement was the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Here, Chief Justice Earl Warren ruled that segregated schools could never be separate but equal, and the Warren Court became a term used to describe active social change, especially throughout the black American media, who proclaimed the Brown decision to be a second Emancipation Proclamation. Rosa Parks was an icon for the black civil rights movement during the 1950s and 60s. In 2000, Time magazine even published an article naming her one of the top 100 most significant persons of the 20th century. She is best known for her role in the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted from December of 1955 to December of 1956 as a result from her refusing to give her seat in the front of a bus to a white man. The March on Washington led by Martin Luther King Jr. was the climax of the civil rights movement's nonviolent protests. King's infamous speech called for an effective end to segregation and a passage of a final Civil Rights Act. One sign at the march read, "Seek the freedom in 1963 promised in 1863. Although President John F. Kennedy spent his first 2 years in office focusing on international issues, he was forced to acknowledge the civil rights movement after this massive March on Washington. Following the legendary "I Have a Dream" speech given by King at the march, President Kennedy finally addressed the issue of a Civil Rights Act. The assassination of Kennedy did halt the passage of the Civil Rights Act. However, his successor, Lyndon Johnson, ensured its enactment just 5 days after Kennedy's death as a memorial for his late predecessor. The historic Civil Rights Act was finally passed by Congress in 1964, a full 101 years after President Abraham Lincoln's original Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. All of the violence endured and bravely sacrificed lives given for this righteous cause were at long last granted the rights that African Americans throughout the United States had been valiantly fighting towards for over 100 years. Although this was the federal law the civil rights movement had been striving for, there remained a couple additional issues of equality for the empowered movement to tackle. The first of these being the issue of voting. With the Jim Crow laws continuing to bar voting throughout the South, Black Americans knew the Civil Rights Act was not quite the end of their fight for full freedom. Therefore, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, giving federal officials the sole power to register voters, rather than the local state officials, who were the ones responsible for enforcing the Jim Crow laws. Along with the passage of the 24th Amendment outlawing the poll tax that prevented poor blacks from voting, the issue of African American voting rights had also been solved. The final issue tackled by the Warren Court was the topic of interracial marriage. In 1956, Mildred Jeter, a black woman, and her marriage to Richard Loving, a white man, was outlawed in Virginia under the ruling of the Circuit Court of Caroline County. Effectively, the couple was forced to move out of the state. However, they decided to challenge the decision 11 years later in the now infamous Warren Court. In the Loving v. Virginia case, Chief Justice Warren ruled it unconstitutional to bar the marriage between a man and woman based on race. With the passing of mainly the Civil Rights Act, but additionally the Voting Rights Act and the legalization of interracial marriages, as well as the enforcement of these rights by federal marshals, blacks in America had at long last gained the freedom they had been imprisoned for speaking on and lost lives for acting on. By the 1970s, most all of the impacts of the Jim Crow laws had been outlawed. With bravery and determination of so many powerful black Americans throughout the previous 100 years, the legal issues of inequality had been solved. However, the social change remained a large issue throughout the remainder of the 20th century and into the early 21st. With African American rights movements continuing to challenge social inequalities, we owe our now incredibly accepting modern world to their determination.